Okay, so welcome everyone to another deep dive. Today we're going to kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about World War II.
Okay.
But, we always try to find interesting sources for these deep dives, and I think we've got a really good one for you today. It's just called Combat in Europe, World War II.
Okay.
It's a PDF. We'll have a link in the show notes for you if you want to check it out yourself. But we're going to go through some of the most interesting parts and,
Yeah.
and kind of try to understand, what was going on, especially like the human element of it,
Yeah.
not just the dates and battles, but like, what was it like to be there? What was it like to be in that war?
Yeah, that's always the interesting part to me as a historian, I think, is, getting at the kind of human stories behind these big historical events. It's easy to get lost in the numbers and the big picture stuff, but, these are all ultimately human stories,
Yeah.
There are millions of individual experiences that make up these larger events.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially I think World War II, we've all seen the movies and documentaries, but to actually read some of these accounts from people who are there, it really gives you a different perspective.
Definitely. There's something about reading a firsthand account that really brings it home in a way that, a textbook or a film just can't quite capture.
Right. And I think one of the things that really struck me going through this document was just how unprepared a lot of countries were for Germany's blitzkrieg.
Oh, yeah. Blitzkrieg was a game changer. It completely revolutionized warfare. The speed and the aggression of it, it was just overwhelming for a lot of the armies at the time.
Yeah.
They were still kind of thinking in terms of World War I tactics, trench warfare and slow moving fronts. And then all of a sudden, you've got these panzer divisions just bursting through the lines and dive bombers, raining down from the sky. It was a shock to the system for sure.
Yeah, and it worked. I mean, you look at the fall of Poland, the conquest of France, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, all in, a relatively short period of time.
Right. And the psychological impact of that cannot be overstated. Imagine you're a soldier in 1939, you're in France, you think you're relatively safe behind the Maginot Line, and then boom, 6 weeks later, the Germans are in Paris. It was just devastating for morale.
Yeah.
And then you think about the civilians caught in the middle of all this,
Right.
having to flee their homes, living under occupation. The document really gets into the human cost of the war, not just for the soldiers, but for everyday people.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking to read some of these accounts.
Yeah.
People being forced into labor, families being torn apart, the constant fear of persecution. And it wasn't just physical hardship, it was psychological too. The document talks about the crushing weight of living under Nazi rule, the constant threat of violence, the feeling of being trapped.
Absolutely. The psychological toll of war is something that often gets overlooked, but it's just as real as the physical wounds. And, in World War II, you had millions of people across Europe living under this oppressive regime for years. That kind of trauma, it doesn't just disappear when the war ends.
No, it doesn't. And, it's interesting because the document also talks about how even in the darkest of times, under Nazi occupation, there were still these pockets of resistance, people finding ways to fight back, even if it was just small acts of sabotage or, helping to hide refugees.
Yeah, and that's, I think, one of the things that makes the human spirit so remarkable, even in the face of such overwhelming oppression. There's still this will to resist, this refusal to be broken. And you see that throughout history in all sorts of conflicts.
Right. And I think that spirit of resistance really started to turn the tide of the war, especially, around 1942, 1943, with the Soviet Union's resistance and then the Allied landings in 1944.
Oh, yeah. D-Day was a major turning point, not just militarily, but psychologically as well. Imagine you're in France, you've been living under Nazi occupation for 4 years, and then suddenly you see thousands of ships on the horizon. It was a sign that things were finally starting to change.
Yeah. And the document also gets into some of the psychological effects of the war on the soldiers themselves. They use terms like shell shock and combat fatigue, which today we would call PTSD. But back then, they were just starting to understand the impact of trauma on the human mind.
Right. And even then, there was a lot of stigma attached to it. Soldiers were expected to just suck it up and keep fighting. And a lot of them did, but the psychological scars, they ran deep. The document talks about soldiers having nightmares, flashbacks, anxiety, depression. Some of them are never the same after what they experienced.
Yeah, it's really sobering to think about. And it makes you wonder, what kept them going? What drove these soldiers to keep fighting in the face of such unimaginable horror?
Well, the document suggests a few things. Patriotism, a sense of duty to their comrades. the belief that they were fighting for a just cause. And in some cases, maybe even just fear. Fear of letting their buddies down, fear of what would happen if they didn't win. It's probably a combination of all those factors and more.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's such a complex issue, but I think it's important to remember that these were real people, with their own hopes and dreams and fears, and they were fighting for something, whether it was for their country, for their families, or just for the chance to go home.
Exactly. And I think as we reflect on World War II, it's important to remember not just the big battles and the political figures, but also the individual stories of the people who lived through it. The soldiers, the civilians, the resistance fighters. Their stories are what make history come alive. And they remind us that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can endure.
Yeah, that's a great point. And, as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's a good reminder for all of us to be grateful for the sacrifices that were made by those who came before us. And to remember that the freedoms that we enjoy today, they weren't free. They were hard-won, and they came at a great cost.
Absolutely. And we should never forget the lessons of World War II, the importance of standing up to tyranny, the dangers of hatred and prejudice, and the need to work together to build a more peaceful and just world.
Well said. Well, I think that's a good place to leave it for today. Thanks for joining us on another deep dive, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me.
Take care.
You too.